Hello, and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining the Cārvāka, or the early school of Indian materialists. I would like to start, as per usual, with some disclaimers. When we are facing the Cārvāka, who are the early materialist tradition within the Indian philosophical wellspring, we're dealing with a similar problem that we saw with the early Greek philosophers. We're talking about a group of writers who are, generally speaking, only preserved in fragments in other philosophers, theologians, and writers' texts. And in this case in particular, we're talking about fragments of work which are, one would say, preserved in a hostile tradition. Generally speaking, the Jains, the Buddhists, and the Brahminical Hindu texts which preserve the workings of the Cārvāka are quite hostile to the materialist tradition, seeing them as a hedonist straw man who can be wheeled out at a moment's notice for rhetorical purposes. However, it should be reminded to us that just because we're dealing with the fragmentary tradition and we don't necessarily have access to the original texts, we still can find and use to some great value and interpretation with what does remain to create a holistic narrative, to try and understand the system of thought from the reaction that it provoked in these opposing and often confrontational schools, and then also from what little does remain in terms of the actual texts for us to utilize. So who were the Cārvāka? The Cārvāka were a materialistic, atheistic philosophy, a movement that started approximately around about 400 BCE, although there is some indications that proto-materialistic philosophy was, if not widespread, at least acknowledged around about 600 BCE. The movement continued and developed all the way through until around about the 15th to 16th century BCE, when it was finally extinguished. However, it's important to note that we only really understand Cārvāka or Cārvāka philosophy because of the way which has been reflected in other philosophical texts, as I talked about in the disclaimer. And in this sense, even the name Cārvāka is an important aspect of understanding what the movement itself represented in the eyes of other followers of philosophies within India. One of the other major names which has been used to describe the Cārvāka movement is Lokāyata, which means to be turned towards the worldly or focusing on worldly things. This is where we have this understanding from other movements that Lokayata or Cārvāka is a hedonistic movement, something that's focused on the here and now and on pleasure. However, it's important to note that other Indian texts indicate that the term Lokāyata wasn't necessarily just utilized when referring to the movement of Cārvāka or Lokāyata philosophy, but was also utilized when referring to logic when used to determine what was happening in the natural world. Another name which is used for the Cārvāka movement is the Brihaspataya, which refers to the supposed founder of the movement around about the 400s BCE, called Brihaspati. This is the writer of the original Brihaspata Sutras, which was the original text under which the Cārvāka philosophical system developed, and who is believed to sort of represent that earlier phase of Cārvāka philosophy, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail when we discuss the potential hypothesis of an evolutionary model for the Cārvāka theory. However, it's important to note that Cārvāka philosophy follows a very similar tradition with other Indian philosophies, where there is a single sort of aphoristic collection of works which provides the basis for the philosophical system, which was then later developed upon by commentaries on this original aphoristic text, but then also upon the commentaries themselves. Finally, the name Cārvāka itself is somewhat contested in terms of what its meaning actually is. One of the opponents of Cārvāka sort of saw it as an epithet, stating that it came from a verb within Sanskrit which meant to chew. So the Cārvāka was a movement which ate itself up, in reference to the destructive nature of the hedonistic philosophy. On the other hand, there is some evidence suggesting that Cārvāka refers to another writer within the tradition of Cārvāka philosophy, and so it's actually named after another one of these aphoristic texts or commentaries which come within the broader tradition of the materialists in India. Finally, there is some question as to what is the origin of the Cārvāka system of thought. Now, there is some who argue that Cārvāka itself originates within the Kshatriya, or the warrior caste within Indian society. And the reason for this is because they're stating that a tradition such as this materialistic, focused on the worldly style of thought is much born upon the idea that Indian nobility and Indian kings, rajas, had to day in and day out involve themselves in the affairs of state and make decisions that weren't necessarily in line with the ethical or religious precepts of the Brahminical or ascetic classes. In this sense, you could argue that the ascribing of Cārvāka philosophy to the Kshatriya is sort of like suggesting that the warrior and ruling caste were actually following more in line with Machiavelli's prince as opposed to the tenets found within their own religious and ethical texts. However, there is also the counter-argument that if Lokayata or Cārvāka philosophy had had such an important role to play in the upper classes of Indian society, that it would have actually had a much better reception, and the texts that have been written about it, which were generally written by monks or ascetics or religious figures that were sponsored by this ruling caste, would rather have been a bit more receptive to the idea of Cārvāka or Lokayata philosophy, rather than deriding it so much as a source of hedonism, a source of poor ethical motives, and a misguided approach to understanding the world. The other argument that is made is that Cārvāka philosophy is actually grounded in the day-to-day experience of ordinary people. It's about, rather than these complex metaphysical theological systems which have been built up under the Brahminical or the the counterstroke within the Jain and Buddhist traditions, or the highly complex and esoteric developed traditions within other aspects of Hindu philosophy. Cārvāka is rather a turn towards the concrete, the normal, and the perceptible, something that is available to everyone, regardless of whether they're a individual who has spent their entire life meditating upon the realities of the cosmos, or someone who has spent only a few days living their days as a youth out in a field working as a farmer. Either way, it is difficult to tell, due to the paucity of sources, exactly where the Cārvāka tradition began. So, what is the underlying and defining characteristic of Cārvāka philosophy? Well, I've already mentioned it. They're materialists. And what I mean by materialism in this sense is a philosophy grounded on the idea that there is nothing beyond the world which we perceive. There's nothing beyond the matter with which we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Now, modern materialism, both in India, the West, and the rest of the world, has its own strong scientific groundings. One could argue that scientific materialism is the driving force in most modern sciences, at least modern hard sciences today. However, within the Indian context, within this sort of classical philosophical stage, there are some very specific traits that make it different from the Brahminical and heterodox schools of philosophy, which precede and coexist with materialism right up until its extinguishment in around about the 1500 to 1600s CE. For the Cārvāka, reality was comprised of 4 elements, or in some cases it was listed as 5. They were earth, water, air, and fire, and occasionally space was listed as another 5th element within which the cosmos or reality existed. It's important to note that in the Cārvāka conception of reality, all things are made of some combination of these elements. So the complexities of life, of consciousness, of the motion of celestial bodies, these were all merely more complex combinations of these other elements. and as such there was no metaphysical reality beyond the material. There was no other world, no absolute theory of forms in a Platonic sense, or a Brahman that existed beyond the Atman. Merely what existed is that matter which could be perceived. So within this system of Cārvāka thought, if everything is material, there is a precedence given over direct observation compared to all other forms of knowledge. Cārvāka epistemology sees the only path to knowledge as perceiving the action as it occurs. Now, this was often used to mock the Cārvāka, as they were seen as rejecting both scriptural texts within the Brahminical, Jain, and Buddhist traditions, but also that they were rejecting the logical texts which would develop more broadly throughout Indian philosophy as well as these religious traditions. However, in some ways, this is kind of like accusing the Cārvāka of doing something that they themselves did not ascribe to performing, which is the rejection of logic. The Cārvāka didn't necessarily state that logic and inference was a mechanism that could not be used to establish knowledge, but what they did argue is that the only way to achieve true knowledge was through direct observation, and therefore inference could only be utilized with a healthy dose of skepticism. One of the ways to try and clarify this conception of perception and inference in the Cārvāka tradition is to look at the allegory of the wolf's footprint, which is from within that Cārvāka tradition. Once upon a time, there was a man who was a follower of Cārvāka, and he was married to a woman who believed in the traditional Brahminical conception of the world, with the world beyond, Atman, and the everlasting soul. And he tried to convince her day in and day out of the merits of his own beliefs, but she refused to believe in what he was saying. And so, one day, he said, "Tomorrow there will be some wise men who will come who preach your tradition, and maybe we can talk to them, and they will be able to clarify to me as to why inference, or why their beliefs of the world beyond, are valid and should be followed." Before the night fell, the man and the wife went outside, and the man went onto the road, and with his fingers drew the footprints of a wolf on the dust that had gathered on the road which ran next to their house, making it appear as though a trail of wolf prints led across the road and into the town. The next morning, the man and the wife woke up and went outside. The wolf footprints were still on the road, and then the Brahmins approached. One, looking down, saw the wolf footprints and said to the other, "Look, a wolf must have come in via the road last night, coming in maybe from the forest or the jungle and into the village. I wonder if it's still there." The man then turned to the wife and said, "Look, just as these wise men were tricked by the wolf's footprints on the road, so are the great many people tricked by the Brahmins as to the existence of the other world." There is some evidence suggesting that the Cārvāka school actually developed over time, that Ajita, one of the earliest proto-materialists, who was known as Ajita of the hair shirt, a common ascetic practice of wearing a uncomfortable piece of clothing, emphasized materialistic conceptions of the world, and is seen sort of in that early Vedic through to classical period as the progenitor of the materialist ideas and thoughts. It is then argued that maybe there's this intermediate stage where the Lokayata, or the logicians, utilize their logical, materialist and perception-based philosophy essentially to attack and undermine the Brahminical and heterodox practices of the Jains and the Buddhists. But then over time, as Buddhist and Indian logic developed and became more sophisticated, that the Lokayata themselves ended up incorporating aspects of this thought in what would become the Cārvāka Sutras, given to the movement by Cārvāka, where there was an incorporation of these other forms of logic, where now inference was seen as a valid, although a less important mechanism by which an individual can gain knowledge. And the example often given is the Cārvāka accepting the idea that smoke can be an inference that there is going to be a fire. And that is seen as something that is logically connected and logically argued for, that does provide real knowledge, but which is nowhere near as direct a source of knowledge as observation. And in this sense, though we don't necessarily have the direct proof of this, there is an argument that Cārvāka philosophy evolved over time in a dialectic with the other traditions within Indian philosophy. In order to be a materialist, the Cārvākan philosophy must necessarily reject the immaterial, and this is where Cārvāka philosophy has a bone of contention with all other philosophies from the Indian context. I draw this quote directly, or at least attributed to Ajita, that proto-materialist, as probably the greatest and easiest method by which to explain the Cārvākan rejection of the immaterial hypothesis. The being is but a compound of the four great primary elements. After death, the earth element returns and goes back to the body of the earth, the water element returns and goes back to the body of the water, the fire element returns and goes back to the body of the fire, and the air element returns and goes back to the body of the air, while the mental faculties pass into space. The four pallbearers and the bier, constituting the fifth, carry the corpse. The remains of the dead can be seen up to the cemetery where bare bones lie, greying like the colour of the pigeons. All alms-giving ends in ashes. Fools prescribe almsgiving, and some assert that there is such a thing as merit in almsgiving, but their words are empty, false, and nonsensical. Both the fool and the wise are annihilated and destroyed after death, and the dissolution of their bodies. Nothing exists after death. Obviously, the rejection of the immaterial put the Cārvāka philosophy in direct competition with the Buddhists, the Jains, and the Brahminical traditions. What this is best emphasized in is the way in which the Cārvākan philosophy is disdainful of the goals of these religions. One of the allegories used by Cārvāka philosophy is that a religion is kind of like telling a man who has a piece of fruit in his hand to lick his elbow. People, instead of focusing on the real good that can be achieved in this life, instead spend their time and their effort and their money looking at preparing themselves for an afterlife. And once again we see that rejection of almsgiving, the rejection of the rituals, and the rejection of all of the metaphysical backdrop that is given within the Vedas and also within the heterodox traditions within India. So, is Cārvākan philosophy nothing more than a justification for gross hedonism? A justification for us to follow and pursue our base desires? I think that there is possibly more to Cārvākan philosophy than this. If we look at it through the eyes of the proto-materialist, Ajita, we see an ascetic, someone who's rejecting the base life, the life of the addict, and instead pursuing good within this world, yes, but not necessarily just those sensual pleasures that a hedonist would. So perhaps we need to understand that Cārvākan philosophy, having been tainted with the brush of its opponents, is actually more of a complex phenomena that is drawing upon not only its own unique and original contribution of materialism, but also the logical traditions that are found in the other schools of Indian philosophy. So, in conclusion, Cārvākan philosophy can really be seen as a mixture of a reliance on perception over inference and a belief in the predominance of the material, the fact that the material is the only thing that exists. But why is this Cārvākan philosophy important? I think there is two major reasons why we should take some time to understand Cārvākan philosophy. The first is that Cārvākan philosophy has an influence within its own tradition. It provides a mirror, in some sense, that other philosophical traditions bounce off and develop in their own ways. Obviously very critically, and it's not like they're essentially taking holistic aspects of Cārvākan doctrine as their own, but it acts as a boundary on one could say one far side of the Indian spectrum of philosophical positions. Secondly, I think Charvakan philosophy is important because it shows that sometimes the stereotypical conception of Indian philosophy as being rooted deeply in religion, rooted deeply in these sort of spiritual, mystic understandings of the world, don't necessarily hold true across the entirety of both the cultural context and the rest of the civilization. We should never try and stereotype an entire tradition on the basis of its most prolific and its most well-read philosophical traditions. Instead, we should understand it as a complex, both interweaving and competition between differing points of view and differing systems of thought. Thank you for listening to this episode of Foolish Musings. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe or follow me on my blog at foolishmusings.com.